When we think of the Tudors, I doubt the name Margaret Douglas comes to mind. Instead, we are pulled towards characters in history, such as Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and Bloody Mary. But in fact, there is a princess who has been lost to history, as she was essentially forgotten. Overshadowed by her own family, Margaret became a forgotten royal in our history. Born on the 8th of October 1515, the Countess of Lennox was the daughter of the Scottish Queen Dowager, Margaret Tudor, making Henry VIII her uncle. But having a King of England as her uncle came with its dangers, for Margaret would go on to anger King Henry VIII on 2 separate occasions, but with each occasion being showered in scandal and an illicit affair. Margaret would find herself imprisoned in the Tower of London for a total of 4 years, yet she still managed to serve 5 out of 6 of the king's wives. The scheming of Lady Margaret Douglas would help to bring about one of the most notorious royal marriages of the 16th century, yet she has now become someone that has been mostly forgotten. Margaret Douglas was a prominent and important figure, and today we are here to try and tell her story. Margaret was born to Margaret Tudor, sister to the King of England and the tyrant Tudor king that is remembered today, Henry VIII. Margaret's mother was the widow to King James IV of Scotland. After James was killed at Flodden, an impulsive Margaret Tudor married Archibald Douglas, the Earl of Angus. Archibald and Margaret had only one child, and that child was Margaret. Born at a remote Hartbottle castle in Northumberland in 1515, she had a claim to the English throne, but was excluded from the succession in 1544 when England was at war with Scotland. Nevertheless, she remained a dynastic threat to the Tudors, especially Elizabeth I, who hated her. When Margaret's mother died, her father stole her away and took her to Tantallon Castle in Scotland, where she then learned to fly hawks. James V, her half-brother, then rescued her and helped her to escape through the sea gate, where she was then met by the captain of Berwick and then returned to England. Henry VIII had a lot to say about the relationships his sister had, and he disapproved especially of her marriage to the Earl of Angus. Margaret Douglas found herself being brought up in the household of her aunt, Mary Tudor, and then after this found herself in the household of her cousin, the future Mary I. Mary and Margaret would grow to become extremely close friends. Now, interestingly, Margaret was a lady of honour to Anne Boleyn, yet it was only after the execution of Anne that Henry VIII found out about his niece's actions. You see, Margaret had secretly pre-contracted herself to Lord Thomas Howard, the younger brother of the Duke of Norfolk. Margaret had done this without the king's permission and was therefore sent to the Tower of London with her lover, where they were both imprisoned. They were then sentenced to death on an act of attainder. Henry was convinced that Thomas wanted his throne, so in Henry's eyes this was the appropriate action to take. This act was the first to legislate on royal marriages, and it forbade any member of the royal family to marry without a royal assent in future, meaning that both Margaret and Thomas were condemned, retrospectively, under a statute that had not been in force when they committed what was now a capital offence. Henry, however, actually had a soft spot for his niece, and found himself sparing the pair from death, and instead just kept them locked up in the Tower. A poignant reminder of the doomed romance is the love poems that still survive to this day. For Thomas died of a fever while still in prison in 1537. Margaret was then pardoned, but she too became unwell, so the king sent her to Sion Abbey to recover. Margaret, it seemed, was doomed to set herself up to fail. If one was imprisoned in the Tower of London for their crimes, you'd think they may then be put off from repeating their mistakes, but Margaret, as she very often did, failed to learn the lessons of her experiences. In 1541, she again infuriated the king when she had an affair with Charles Howard, the brother of Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Luckily for Margaret, King Henry was that upset with the discovery of his wife's sexual crimes that he allowed Margaret to be let off with a reprimand. When Catherine's household was disbanded, Margaret was sent to Kenning Hall, the home of the Duke of Norfolk. Margaret was sent alongside her friend Mary Howard, and for around 2 years Margaret stayed, and then in 1543, after attending the wedding of her uncle and Catherine Parr, Margaret became one of Catherine's chief ladies-in-waiting. In 1544, determined, in the face of Scottish resistance, to bring Scotland under Tudor rule by marrying his son Edward to the young Mary Queen of Scots, Henry arranged for Margaret to marry the handsome and cultivated Matthew Stewart, the Earl of Lennox, a Scottish exile in England. Lennox had betrayed his country by offering his allegiances to the king, and he promised to capture Dumbarton Castle, which Henry regarded as the key to conquering Scotland. The arranged marriage turned into an enduring love match. A pendant, the Lennox jewel, probably given to Margaret by Lennox, survives in the royal collection, its symbolism encapsulating their love and devotion and their dynastic hopes. Sadly, of their 8 children, only 2 survived infancy: Henry, Lord Darnley, and Charles, who would succeed his father as Earl of Lennox. Through this marriage, Margaret, a determined intriguer, became deeply involved in Anglo-Scottish politics. Under the reign of her cousin Mary I, Margaret would emerge as a staunch Catholic and was prominent at court. Mary wanted Margaret to be the person to succeed her on the throne instead of her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth. Mary feared Elizabeth, but Parliament would not hear of her plans for Margaret. When Elizabeth took her place on the throne of England in 1558, there was no place for Margaret in court, and so she retired to her house at Temple Newsham and Serrington in Yorkshire, which later became the centre of Catholic intrigue. Margaret did not recognise Elizabeth's title to the throne and was ready to subvert the new Anglican settlement. The enmity was mutual. Elizabeth feared Margaret, and she feared all her female relations of royal blood. Margaret had one aim now, and that was to marry her son, Lord Darnley, to the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots. This was a plan greatly opposed by Elizabeth I. For her plotting, Margaret endured a long spell under house arrest at Sheen, and she was sent to the Tower when Darnley rode north in 1565 and married Queen Mary without Elizabeth's permission. Margaret remained in prison until 1567, when Darnley was murdered in Edinburgh, aged just 20, and Elizabeth released her out of compassion. The death of her son left Margaret distraught with grief. Mary was denounced as the culprit, but she and her family were never able to bring anyone to justice for Darnley's murder. In 1572, Mary and Margaret reconciled as, by this point, Margaret believed Mary's innocence and now believed it to be Mary's third husband, Lord Bothwell, to be the man behind the murder of her son. Sadly, Margaret never did find the truth, and ironically, it was one of her own, Douglas kinsmen. In the year 1570, Margaret's husband went north to Scotland and was appointed regent for their young grandson James VI. James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and their son Darnley, but the rule of Lennox proved to be rather controversial. He stirred up old feuds and was then assassinated in 1571. This left Margaret in a state of devastation and grief that was described as poignant and perpetual. Margaret's remaining son Charles was thought to be an unruly teenager. Margaret wanted him to be taken into the household of the Queen's chief minister to install some discipline, but instead Lord Burleigh found him a tutor who saw a great promise in the young boy. Even now, Margaret was busy scheming. In 1574, she combined forces with another arch-intriguer, the formidable Bess of Hardwicke, to marry Margaret's heir Charles to Bess's daughter, Elizabeth Cavendish, which inevitably provoked Queen Elizabeth's wrath. Off Margaret went once more to the Tower, but she was soon released. After Charles died in 1576, she devoted her energies in bringing up her granddaughter, Arabella Stuart, in whom were now vested all the Lennox claims to the throne. Margaret lived until the age of around 62, passing away in 1578. She had dined with Robert Dudley, the favourite of Queen Elizabeth, and the rumour was that he poisoned her, although this seems unlikely. Elizabeth, although begrudgingly, allowed the princess to have a tasteful funeral, and Margaret was buried in Westminster Abbey. Margaret had a life full of both blessings and curses, all from love. Margaret stated that her short stay in the Tower had not been for matters of treason, but for matters of love. Margaret shared something in common with her female cousin. She too was seen by Elizabeth as a threat to the throne and imprisoned in the Tower of London. But the one thing that sets her apart from the rest is that Margaret Douglas was freed and managed to retain her position at court. She was a lucky survivor in the brutality of the 16th century of politics, and furthermore, Margaret Douglas died in her bed and not at the hands of an axeman like poor Lady Jane Grey or Mary Queen of Scots, or in prison like Lady Catherine Grey. An interesting point before we come to a close is that although Margaret was known as a princess, this title was issued by the Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis, but Margaret, although referred to as the Princess of Scotland, was not a princess at all, either of England or Scotland. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.